You remember a childhood that felt mostly offline. You played outside until the streetlights came on. You memorized phone numbers. You waited for your favorite show to come on at a specific time because there was no replay button. But at the same time, you also adapted to the internet, smartphones, social media, and digital life faster than the generations before you. You learned how to exist in both. People born roughly between the late 1970s and the early 1980s often fall into this small generational window known as Xennials. And psychologically, it creates a very interesting identity. Because Xennials didn't just grow up with change, they grew up through it. And that tends to shape how they think, work, connect with people, and even how they understand themselves. On the surface, many Xennials look adaptable. They understand technology well enough to keep up with younger generations, but they also carry the independence and resilience often associated with older ones. But underneath that adaptability is something deeper, a constant sense of standing between worlds. Many Xennials remember a childhood where independence was expected very early. Parents often worked long hours, kids entertained themselves. There was less supervision, fewer digital distractions, and a lot more unstructured time. So emotionally, many of them learned to self-regulate early. They figured things out on their own. If something broke, you tried to fix it. If you were bored, you found something to do. If you felt uncomfortable, you usually just dealt with it quietly. That kind of environment tends to build a strong internal problem-solving mindset. But it also creates a habit of carrying things alone. And that pattern often continues into adulthood. You might notice it in small ways. Xennials often hesitate before asking for help, not because they think they're better than others, but because somewhere in their conditioning, there's a quiet belief that they're supposed to handle things themselves. It's not pride, it's familiarity. Handling things alone is simply what life looked like growing up. At the same time, this generation witnessed something that no other generation experienced in quite the same way: a complete technological shift. One moment life was analog: cassette tapes, VHS players, handwritten notes, and landline phones attached to walls. The next moment it became digital: email, instant messaging, smartphones, social media, and a world that suddenly moved much faster. For Xennials, this transition didn't happen in childhood like it did for Gen Z, and it didn't happen late in adulthood like it did for older generations. It happened during identity formation, and that timing matters psychologically, because identity is often shaped by the environment we learn to navigate. Xennials learned the rules of an analog world, and then had to quickly relearn the rules of a digital one. That creates a unique cognitive flexibility, but it can also create a quiet sense of displacement. Sometimes Xennials feel slightly out of sync with both sides, too digitally aware to fully relate to older generations, but too familiar with slower, offline life to feel completely aligned with younger ones. And here's where it gets interesting. Because the real psychological pattern isn't just about technology, it's about adaptation. Xennials became experts at adjusting to change without necessarily having time to process it. Think about how quickly things shifted during their young adulthood. The rise of the internet, the transformation of workplaces, the early days of social media, the expectation to constantly update skills and stay relevant. This created a generation that often feels responsible for keeping up. And when you spend years adapting, you can start to define yourself through that adaptability. You become the person who figures things out, the one who learns new systems, the one who bridges the gap between people who don't understand technology and those who grew up fully immersed in it. But psychologically, that role can also create pressure. Because when you're always the adapter, you rarely get to stand still. Many Xennials carry a quiet sense that the world is always speeding up, and they're expected to keep pace. Even when they're tired, you might see it in how they approach work. For many Xennials, the answer is simply both, and neither. which is why this generation often becomes quiet translators between people. At work, they might explain technology to older colleagues while also helping younger ones understand workplace norms. In families, they often bridge communication styles between parents and younger relatives. They're used to moving between perspectives, and that ability isn't accidental. It comes from growing up during a cultural shift that forced constant adjustment. But here's the deeper psychological layer. Adaptation can look like strength on the outside, and often it is. But adaptation also means repeatedly letting go of what used to feel stable. Old systems disappear, old expectations change, and each shift asks you to rebuild a sense of certainty. For Xennials, this process happened again and again during formative years, so they often developed a mindset that expects change, even when things seem stable. It's not pessimism, it's pattern recognition. They've seen how quickly the world can transform, and that awareness quietly shapes how they approach the future. In the end, the psychology of Xennials isn't just about being between two generations. It's about growing up during a turning point in modern life. They experience the last chapter of an offline world and the first chapter of a fully digital one. That perspective creates a unique kind of awareness, one that understands where things came from while still learning where they're going. And once you recognize that pattern, something becomes clearer. The feeling of being slightly between worlds was never random. It was simply the position this generation was shaped to occupy, right in the middle of change. And once you see it, you can't really unsee it. Because sometimes identity isn't about fitting neatly into a category. Sometimes it's about being the bridge between them. And that role says more about a generation than most people realize. If this explained something you've quietly noticed about yourself, there's always more to uncover. Because understanding the patterns behind our behavior is often where self-awareness begins.